everyone, and welcome to my tutorial on skin tones. I filmed a commission I worked on and will try to show you some techniques and talk about colour choices. I'm working on Velour pastel paper, and if you'd like to know more about this surface, check out the link to my Velour tips in the description below. Here I have my line sketch on the Velour and the simple background blocked in already. My sketch looks really clean here, as I sketched on normal drawing paper, then transferred it onto the Velour. I like to do this as you can't rub out on Velour. As with all my tutorials, this is a mixture of real-time and speeded up footage to try and give you as much info but without boring you to tears. The first thing I'm doing is creating some of the darkness surrounding her face. As always with pastel, you want to work mainly dark to light. Now I begin to pick out some of her prominent features and darkest areas with Unison A27. When I initially sketch the face, there are a lot more lines and shading. Then by the time I transfer this to the Velour, it's much simpler, allowing me to build up the form now with blocks of colour instead of lines. I'm looking for all the shadow areas and always rubbing the pastel I've applied well into the paper. At this stage, I want to really darken this area to the right and bring some colour down to her neck. Sometimes the neck makes sense for me to start with, as her chin and cheeks will sit in front of this. Bear in mind though, everything I do is just my approach. I'm not saying this is the correct way, but I believe there are many paths to an outcome and no wrong way to do something. There's lovely directional light coming from the left. This creates those dark shadows, and I'm really using the neck area to get a feel for some of the warm tones. And one important tip for Velour is to always remember to rub the pastel into the paper. This will help it stick and let the next layers go on top. Now it seems strange to outline her chin in blue here, but her jumper is reflecting off the bottom of her jawline. And now I take some of the lighter highlight colours like A7 and add some of this sunlit area. I'm not leaning heavily when I do this. The key is to build up thin layers which are all visible. Skin is not just one solid colour. So now I want to add some warmth to those cheeks. A nice fleshy pink, but I'll not go overboard here as her skin is quite pale in the photograph. Apologies for the slight wobble in the video from time to time. As many of you know, I'm filming in the back of a motorhome and didn't realise that there was a bit of movement in the table. I'll sort this out before my next video. I'm a bit of a work in progress with these videos, but I'm really trying to improve their quality for you, so please stick with me, and if you like what I'm doing, hit subscribe. So between a mixture of A27 and something like BE21, I'm still just roughly picking out her features and placing the shadow areas. Each time I come back to strengthen this dark area, I'm being mindful of her cheek and jawline. This time I'm using a dark charcoaly brown and noticing where the light meets the dark. And usually after adding the darkest areas, I like to add some of the brightest areas too, so I have the two extremes to measure everything else off. Here I'm using Unison's Grey 27 to bring out her left side, which is being hit by the light. Now some light peachy pinks like RE7 and some earthy beige like BE14, and I'm really just adding little thin patches of colour and blending. I always like to use some blue violets or even greens in Skintones. Here I'm adding some cool blue violet into her shadows. It seems a strange colour to add to skin, but it's good to think of the opposite colours even in portraiture. The blue will be a nice contrast to those peachy tones. And now I continue doing a little highlighting. It really helps to bring out the form of her features. Some of these earthy beige tones bring more warmth to the skin, and I keep strengthening the brightest areas with Grey 27. Grey 27 is a lovely yellowy white, and I often use this as my lightest tone as it's a lot less stark than pure white. But I'll include a list of the colours I've used in this in the description below, so you can check out all the colours there. It's mostly Unison pastels, and they are my go-to pastel for everything. You really don't need these exact colours though, you can substitute for something similar. Most of my pastels are broken or worn down into different shapes and shards. This is what makes small detail possible with something as chunky as pastel sticks. Coming back in with a deeper pink like A18 to add more warmth down this side of her nose. Notice I'm applying it so lightly, just a film of colour which blends with the layer below. So I'm still picking out solid blocks of colour on the planes of her face. At this point nothing is done too neatly, as the fine tuning will come later. And some of these highlights are areas catching the light on the shadow side. I'm using a bit of A19 for this. You can see here how I'm applying the pastel in circular motions. By using thin layers I can almost blend it into the layer below and keep hard edges to a minimum. And I'm starting to think about this area around her eyes now. Her fringe creates a bit of shadow and I'll want to have her forehead in there before adding the hair on top later. Now I use Unison RE16 for around the eyes and nostrils. I plan to use some pastel pencils in dark browns and a bit of black for the detail in these areas, but I do want some warmth in there first. With children's portraits especially, I don't want to age her with too much darkness and too many hard lines. A little Unison BE9 to mix some orangey tones in along with the pink. So the first little bit of pastel pencil now, and I'm using a dark brown to strengthen the eyelids and the nostrils a little. I'm really using the pencil lightly, shading with it almost. Once I give this a rub, then it all softens nicely into the pastel below. And now I'm trying to pick out some of the more subtle highlights on the right, all the time blending the edges into the layers below. You'll notice sometimes I use some diagonal mark making. It's a little like cross-hatching with the pastel, making a smooth texture without having to blend too heavily. By using thin layers you'll achieve more depth to your skin tones. Also, by using thin layers, I can continue to make my brightest areas gradually brighter and eventually find these areas, like on her cheekbone, which have the brightest glow. Again, using nice soft diagonal strokes to add some vibrance to this cheek, and then strengthening the dark crease. It takes a constant measuring of all the values and judging what needs to be adjusted. This tool is something I use a lot in people portraits. It's a tortillon made from paper. They come in different sizes. It's useful for blending and rubbing at small areas. Often I'll use it to really score away the lighter layers to reveal the dark that I applied initially. I can uncover the lower dark layer without having to apply more dark or use a hard pastel pencil. You can see the difference I'm making is subtle, but that's good, as a child's face has much more subtlety than an older face. Hard lines and harsh contrast will age a child, and you really want to try and capture the fresh purity of young skin. Be sure to check out my other tutorials. Also, if you have any requests, leave me a comment below and I'll try to make tutorials based on those. So I'm still just making slight adjustments and adding thin layers. At this stage I'm happy with the overall form, and bear in mind almost everything has been applied here using the big soft sticks. I'll be able to now push this around and tweak things into place using my tortillon and some pastel pencil. Again, that tortillon makes a great tool for pushing the pigment around. tip for when you're applying your diagonal marks: if you want them to blend in smoothly, try rubbing them in the opposite direction. Again, this is all a little bit like cross-hatching. And all of a sudden we have two eyes looking at us. This video I thought was long enough, so I've decided to make a separate video on her eyes, which you can also see on my channel. Adding more warmth and rich darkness to this neck area. I've realised that this right side could do with being a little darker, so I'm using some RE16 and a dark charcoaly brown like dark 5 to bring it down a few degrees in tone. Before I touch up her chin area, I add a little more of that blue violet, which will show through as the reflection of her jumper. Don't forget to look for other colours reflected in the things you're painting. Light bounces off everything, so try to see the other colours you wouldn't necessarily associate with your subject matter. Now some small adjustments, strengthening bright areas and working on the chin. Her ears are barely visible, so I use BE23, a fleshy purple, and know that her hair will mostly obscure this ear. Around the top of her eyes is quite in shadow due to her fringe. I come back in with some A27 and darken her eyebrow bone area. I'm constantly looking at the shapes of the light and shadow planes on her face. It's around this time that the pastel pencils become useful for the small adjustments. The pencil doesn't always apply that well on velour until you have a few layers of pastel down. Using a dark brown for the darkest areas in the creases. You'll see me often use 3 light coloured pencils. This very pale grey is great for highlights on shadow areas. I also use a pale yellow and a pure white for sunlit areas. I work quite slowly at this point, spending almost more time studying the photo to really understand each little curve and sweep of the lines. This is the pale yellow, which really helps with the fine highlight around the nostril on the sunlit side. Again, I'm not using the pencil heavily here. It's more like a bit of scumbling and pushing the pigment around. Bit by bit, the shapes I'm creating are getting smaller as I add more and more detail to each area. The nose really starts to pop out now when I add the highlights a bit stronger. As I work on smaller areas, you'll notice the pastel pieces get smaller for the job. I liken it to picking up different size brushes when you're oil painting. You wouldn't tackle a portrait with one brush, so it makes sense that you need different size pieces of pastel. The great news is that they naturally wear down like this, or you can break them to find edges, and you won't have a load of brushes to clean at the end. So many pluses to using pastel. Work as long as you want, then pack it away and come back to it whenever you want. I create a minimal amount of mess, which is also good when you work in a motorhome. My studio space, however, is well ventilated with lots of windows, which is good for pastel dust. Down to the minor adjustments, making sure those shadow areas are dark enough, and adding final highlights. Some final tweaks to her chin, adding some of those little dimples which are catching the light. I continue to soften hard lines and alter the shapes ever so slightly. Before I work on her mouth, I strengthen the creases at her cheeks. Because I only wanted this tutorial to cover skin, you'll see her mouth magically appear soon. Again, I'll come back and do a mouth tutorial soon. Some final highlighting and small splashes of colour. I do hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. If you found it helpful, please subscribe, as I'm gradually building a library of these and would love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to check out the description for some helpful links. Thanks for watching.